Today we're going to talk about Last Night in Soho, and boy howdy are we going to get into it. So before we get started, I'm going to need a Vespa. Last Night in Soho is a 2021 horror mystery co-written by Edgar Wright and Krysty Wilson-Cairns, directed by Wright and starring the likes of Thomasin McKenzie, Anya Taylor-Joy, Matt Smith, Michael Ajao, and the late Diana Rigg. The movie tells the story of Eloise Turner, sometimes Ellie, an 18-year-old aspiring fashion designer off to university in London with literal baggage full of 1960s vinyl and the metaphorical baggage of her mother's death by suicide in the same big city. Alienated by her rich, mean, hard-partying classmates, Ellie moves into a rundown bedsit in Soho where she begins having dreams about a 1960s blonde bombshell and aspiring singer named Sandy. Nervous and out of place, Ellie is magnetized by the confident, commanding, and sexually in her own Sandy and begins to take on some of her style and mannerisms, while at the same time neglecting her waking life in favor of the dream world. Until the fantasy takes a dark turn when Sandy's would-be boyfriend and manager, Jack, begins pressuring her to sleep with men who he claims will help her work her way up the showbiz ladder. Sandy is trapped in a life she doesn't want to be living, and the waking Ellie spirals as the boundary between real life and her fantasy-turned-nightmare world grows less and less distinct. And it's here that I'd like to take a moment to just walk you through my experience of this movie up to this point, because it's hard to put words to just how hooked I was. I will put my objective art criticism hat back on before too long, but like all critiques, this one is deeply rooted in how it hit me as a person, and the story I want to tell you needs this foundation. So if you will indulge me, Ellie's experience at school mirrors mine in ways that drill right to my core. My big city was New York, not London, and my craft was acting, not fashion, and I was carrying the weight of some very different family traumas. But the emotional heart of this story beats right in time with that period of my life, and God, does it just sting and rock to go on that journey with someone else. The feeling of being in the best city in the world to make the art you want to make, to be training in the best place to train for it, with an authority that has said you are good enough to do it, and getting there to find a lot of other people who are also there for that, but have recognized a lot faster and more thoroughly than you have that you're also all young adults on your own in one of the best cities in the world to be a young adult. And you're not just here to make art, you're also here to be people. And for a lot of folks, being people means staying up late and drinking a lot and having sex in inconvenient places. And, you know, maybe you'd have been up for that if you'd been able to really prepare for it, but it's a lot to figure out all at once, and you start to feel like everyone else got some sort of instructions you didn't get about how to be in this stage of life, and you're in a glass box watching it happen around you, and you can't break out of it to be part of this community. And you're not really sure you'd want to anyway, because sex and drugs look kind of scary, and you're really just here for the rock and roll. And so I, like Ellie, kind of pulled away. Not all the way. I had the advantage of a bigger university couching my program and roommates from outside that tiny bubble who were just as conflicted about the idea of capital P partying as I was. It's also worth saying explicitly that none of my classmates were ever mean to me in the way Ellie's are. They were nice to me, and so far as I know, they genuinely wanted me to come out with them because they liked me. I was just a sheltered kid who had literally never been offered a drink in my life and needed a bit of an adjustment period before I could decide how I felt about it and figure out where my people were. So, like Ellie, my first semester of art school involved a lot of everything but a classic college experience. I delved into deep, dark, unrequited love for a high school classmate that allowed me to process my homesickness in a way that felt exciting and romantic instead of pathetic, which is how the idea of admitting I actually was a little bit homesick felt. Freshmen weren't allowed to audition for shows, but I knocked out my crew requirements and signed up for extra ones to keep me making and watching theater and give me legitimate answers to the questions that felt like precursors to invitations. Oh, sorry, I can't come out tonight. I have an early crew call in the morning. Have fun, though. I spent my late nights doing research that helped me pour my family trauma into my scene work for class, and my even later nights on Tumblr, trying on ways of seeing the world like hats in a makeover montage, and testing out ways of interacting with it in spaces that didn't make me feel like every word out of my mouth was a huge statement on my whole identity, to which I would be held accountable at least until graduation, but probably forever, since everything I had ever wanted for the rest of my life was contained within and accessible through the second and third floors of West 27th Street at Broadway. So I couldn't tell you what particular thing I thought was being analoged by Ellie's dreams exactly, but I honestly felt it all the more for that. I wasn't entirely sure what was literally going on in the movie, but I didn't need to know, or even particularly want to. What I saw was a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, staring down the barrel of the great dream of her life and finding that the folks who were supposed to be her community make her feel completely lost and confused about everything, and retreating into herself to figure out how to be a person in that world. Sandy felt like Ellie's way of testing out who she could be if she got out of her own way. Confident, cool, commanding, effortlessly shutting down the kind of casual sexual harassment part and parcel to young womanhood and the big city without ever losing 1 second of face. So sure of exactly what she wants and what she doesn't, and how to go after the one and brush off the other. And Sandy's tragic turn felt like a manifestation of the fear holding Ellie back. The dangers of trusting the wrong people, the suffering awaiting the artists who don't make it, or worse, required for everyone to grind through whether or not success is waiting on the other side, the slippery slope of a party girl lifestyle, and the violence, both psychological and physical, that expressing any legitimate sexual interests or desires might open her up to. And of course, this is all encompassed in an absolute technical marvel of a movie. Everything Edgar Wright does so well is at absolute peak capacity here. It is a series of very, very good music videos that tie together into one tremendously effective piece of narrative filmmaking with a palpable and unassailable sense of place. It is stunning to look at from minute one, on the level where you watch the Blu-ray commentary track and hear editor Paul Matchless pick out a relatively unassuming shot of two people talking across a bar as his favorite in the film, and at first you're like, really? That one? But then you look at it again and you're like, nah, yeah, that's gorgeous. That commentary, by the way, is Matchless, Wright, and Stephen Price, who wrote the score, and I'm not sure you could pick a trio of roles to highlight that would better indicate a movie will be extremely my shit. Ellie's first dream sequence, Sandy's introduction, is intoxicating on a sheer how did they do that level that only gets better the more behind the scenes footage you watch, and I think we're going to be talking about it for a very long time. It is a beautifully made film that speaks to and on the level of feels. The culmination of this is the sort of second act finale where Ellie finally accepts her kind and persistent but no pressure classmate John's invitation to attend a Halloween dance, where she dissociates into nightmare world, possibly under the influence of a drink drugged by her former roommate and ongoing bully, Jocasta. Desperate not to fall asleep into Sandy's life of forced sex work, Ellie ignores the house rule prohibiting male visitors past 8 o'clock and sneaks John into her apartment. As the two share the beginnings of a very sweet and intimate moment, Ellie has a waking vision of Sandy being killed by Jack in her bed. She becomes increasingly inconsolable, eventually attracting the attention of landlady Ms. Collins, who throws John out. Watching this scene for the first time tapped into something so incredibly subtle and specific about coming of age, especially as a woman, in a world that is so weird about sex, that I don't think I've ever really seen addressed before. All through the movie up to this point, Ellie is constantly barraged with the idea of sex in ways that are varying levels of uncomfortable for her. The first person she meets in London is a cab driver who is not even trying not to look like a creep.
If all you supermodels are going to be in Charlotte Street, you'll see plenty of me, don't you worry.
Her first night out in the city, she sees Jocasta approached by a super forward dude who she tries to quote-unquote playfully shuffle off onto Ellie by implying stuff about Ellie's sexuality that she is clearly uncomfortable talking about.
Oh, you should try that line on Eloise. Bet she's complete filth once you get a few drinks inside her.
And then Jocasta brings the same guy back home to the exact room where Ellie is already half asleep. She sees postcard ads for sex workers everywhere, a man coming out of a strip club leers at her, and her job at a pub subjects her to the exact kind of treatment every bartender, especially the ones perceived as female, will be all too familiar with, including one regular customer who has a history of being so handsy that a coworker good-heartedly describes him as an octopus. On top of this, Ellie is having these dreams about Sandy being essentially trafficked into sex work, which is an idea you have to assume she got from somewhere. So there's this thing that can happen when the closest thing you're getting to sex ed is cromulent but extremely paternalistic warnings about the terrible and exploitative sex-adjacent stuff of which the world is full for women in particular. This is such a subtle thing because sexual violence and exploitation absolutely exist, and we absolutely need education to combat that. But there is a tone to some purported education that can come off less as if it is talking about violence and more like it is talking about sex. There was a play that my high school put on every year called the Respect Yourself skits. It was a series of short vignettes about how premarital sex was bad and dangerous, and it was the only play I ever didn't audition for, which is honestly reflective of principles I'm impressed 16-year-old me managed to stick to, because the Respect Yourself skits were kind of a huge deal. You got to get out of class to go perform them at the middle schools, and they were super dramatic, so at least some of those kids were gonna think you were the absolute shit as an actor. And there were 2 roles that involved a lot of kissing, which I absolutely would have been super jazzed about, but I thought abstinence only was trash, so I guess I had integrity. Good for you, teenage Laura. But one of the pieces, the one that was definitely it was the one that you wanted to see who got cast in it every year because that was the actress. It was a monologue by a character who had been raped while drunk at a party, describing the experience in great detail. In a nominally educational play about how you, the teenager in the audience, should respect yourself by not having premarital sex. I respect you, my audience, enough to trust that I don't need to explain in any more detail why that is beyond fucked up. That's one example, but it's reflective of the whole culture of the messaging I was getting at the time from nearly every angle. I had enough other perspectives to know that it was trash. Like, my mom, God bless her, once overheard me and my sister talking about how our health class had just straight up told us that condoms don't work. And she was like, "They told you that? That's ridiculous." And then she emailed us links to actual good information about birth control. I had the debunking, but I didn't really have any alternative beyond the odd occasional Meg Cabot novel. And the thing that I eventually noticed happening in myself was that I started to have a hard time separating sex, as I experienced it, from sexual violence. Everything remotely sexual, no matter how enthusiastic I was about it, started to make me question if I was being exploited. This is what I saw in Ellie, in bed with a person who has been nothing but kind and gentle and patient and respectful to her. More importantly, a person with whom she's been having the most fun she's had since arriving in this city. And most importantly, a person she, unprompted, enthusiastically, and without the tiniest whiff of pressure, invited up to her room. What I saw in this scene was a young woman who is into this, but is fighting against a full girlhood of squidgy messaging, of having nothing resembling sex positivity or decent sex ed, no acknowledgement beyond the quick and ephemeral of sexual desire as natural or beautiful or worth exploring, only at minimum the pile of sexual microtraumas that is existing in the world as a person perceived as female in a culture that sees womanhood and girlhood as tacit consent to be sexualized. What I saw in this scene was an expressionistic portrayal of a young woman feeling genuine, enthusiastic, consensual sexual curiosity for maybe the first time in her life, and suddenly being smacked with the fact that she has no context for what that looks like, only for how to perceive it as at best too dirty to talk about, and at worst inherently violent. That is not the movie I was watching. The HBO dramedy thriller series The Flight Attendant stars Kaylee Cuoco as Cassie Bowden, an alcoholic party girl who, after a boozy date with a stranger from a flight she attended, wakes up next to a corpse with a slashed throat. She attempts to solve the man's murder through a series of fantasy realm flashbacks in which she converses with the dead man and examines the hotel room where he died. If you've ever seen a TV show before, you will instantly read this as a filmic depiction of a woman searching her memories, trying to brown out a night of heavy drinking and pull out any details that might be significant only in retrospect. Cassie, however, does not know she is in a TV show and spends a shocking amount of the show's runtime berating the dead man for an explanation of who he is and why he's doing this to her and how he could possibly know so many things about her that she's never told anyone.
Why am I back in this room? Where's the plane?
This very well established trope of film and TV language is inscrutably treated as a diegetic thing that is actually happening and requires an explanation now. I bring this up because what I haven't told you about last night in Soho yet is that Ellie is psychic. She literally sees ghosts. So this movie I thought I had been watching, this neon horror expressionism about a young woman working through the complex feelings and fears of growing up through manifestations of her subconscious, unequivocally ends at the hour and 10-minute mark when our psychic heroine witnesses a 60-year-old unsolved murder and becomes a true crime podcaster. It's a bit of a left turn, is all I'm saying. Now, I'm presenting this information to you in the way that I experienced it, which may give you the sense that this is supposed to be a twist that casts everything we've been seeing in a new light. But that is not the movie this movie thinks it is. It is not the movie Edgar Wright seems to have thought he was making, and to its credit, it is also not the movie that plenty of people saw. I did read more than one opening weekend review that picked up on this piece of story without too much trouble, so it's always possible that I'm just a doofus, you know? I hope this channel stands as evidence that I am generally an attentive viewer of film, but if you want to call me a chucklehead, call me a chucklehead. I can take it. But I do feel like there is actually some structural basis to this particular instance of my chuckleheadery, so let me make my case. The closest thing we get to a clear demonstration or explanation of Ellie's psychic powers comes in the movie's opening sequence. Ellie looks at an old photo of her mother and Gran, then looks up at her mirror where she sees her mother behind her.
It's good news, isn't it?
And it is. Her Gran has just come in with Ellie's acceptance letter from the London College of Fashion. While she packs, Gran expresses worry about Ellie going off to the city where her mother died.
She didn't feel things, see things like you do. I worry you'll get all overwhelmed again.
Ellie assures her.
I haven't even seen them in ages.
In the next scene, when Ellie is leaving, she sees her mother in the mirror again. Now, I'm generally someone who is a fan of stories that trust the audience not to need everything spoon-fed to us, and in the context of breaking this down in retrospect, it does seem clear enough. I can see why lots of people did pick up on what was happening. but there are a few reasons why, in context, I still think it's pretty incomplete as a foundation for what follows. First is the issue that everything Gran says feels like normal stuff for a woman in a non-supernatural version of this scenario to say.
I'm just saying, London can be a lot. It was too much for your mum, perhaps.
Maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe up there I won't be reminded of her so much.
Her concerns read pretty flawlessly as worry over the mental health of her sensitive and grieving granddaughter with a known family history, expressed in the kind of delicate language that's pretty normalized for these kinds of discussions.
I thought maybe you'd need more time to get used to being around so many people.
You know, most people aren't just gonna come out and say, Ellie, love, living on your own for the first time in the city where your mum died hasn't been bringing up any suicidal thoughts of your own lately, has it? Especially not Brits. Second is the problem of film language. A character seeing a dead person in a mirror is a pretty well-established convention to demonstrate that they're just thinking about them. This reads very clearly as Ellie being metaphorically haunted, and the movie doesn't really give it enough extra oomph to make it clear that she's also literally haunted. And finally is just a simple flow of information issue. The explanation of the photo of who is in it and when it was taken doesn't come until the packing scene, and the details of Ellie's mother's death aren't revealed until 10 or so screen minutes later when Ellie is already off at school. Now, if the most important information in these scenes were just that Ellie had a mother who died under circumstances that make her gran worry about how she'll handle living in London, this would be fine. It's not like it's difficult to guess that the woman Ellie keeps an old photo of would probably be her mother, and the family drama of Ellie and her gran talking around what exactly happened absolutely works as character development. But that's only one piece of what's happening here, because these moments are also using that information to establish the very important fact of Ellie's psychic gift. And in that sense, it does matter that this all comes out a little backwards. You need to know that this woman is dead in order to understand why I haven't seen her in ages is a meaningful thing to say. Hell, this first moment in the mirror could very well read that Ellie's young but totally alive mom just popped in to say hi. And again, this would all be fine if it were hinting at something to be made more clear later. But moving forward, all we get is that, holy shit, Ellie's gift manifests itself in dreams. She lies down in bed and has visions of stuff happening. Wow, what a wild story of a thing that has never actually literally happened to me, ever. She sees a piece of architecture she remembers from her dream out in the actual neighborhood where she lives. Okay. One time I had a dream that I found something I'd lost in waking life, and when I woke up, lo and behold, there it was in the exact place I dreamt about it. Do I have psychic powers now? But you know, more importantly, this is a movie, and to boot, it's a horror movie. There's a reason the first story beats of A Nightmare on Elm Street play out the way they do. If the basic mechanics of the movie depend on a strict set of rules about exactly how dreams work, you can't just throw stuff out there and assume it's gonna be clear. You need to establish those rules. You need an outside observer to confirm what's going on. Because you're up against a whole lot of established genre conventions, not just for what dreams mean, but for whether it even matters in the first place. Vivid dreams, dreams invading real life, stuff that may or may not be a dream, characters seeing things other characters don't see. In horror particularly, it's totally up in the air how real any of that is supposed to be. The character could literally be seeing ghosts, or this could be more about bringing us into their mental state, and we may or may not actually get an explanation for where on that scale we're landing. Is the Overlook Hotel literally haunted, or are the ghosts representations of Jack Torrance's mental deterioration and Wendy and Danny's fear given physical form to make their experience feel as visceral to us, the audience, as it does to them? The movie doesn't provide a simple answer, and it doesn't need to. You can read it as one or the other, or a combination of both, and you'll get something interesting out of it no matter what. There are also plenty of horror films that have a definitive answer to that question, but use ambiguity to create tension. This is your Scooby-Doo formula. Is something supernatural afoot, or is there a logical explanation that might even turn out to be more horrifying? But Last Night in Soho doesn't do either of those things. It not only has a definitive definitive answer to what exactly these dream figures are, it needs you to understand that as a prerequisite for its final act, assumes that this has been established from minute 3 and you're already on board. If, like me, you're still ambiguous on what exactly is going on, that is the main question and tension of the film. What is happening to Ellie, and how is she going to deal with it? But the tension of the last 40 minutes is unequivocally what happened to Sandy, the human being who actually lived in this literal room 60-odd actual years ago, and can Ellie, the psychic amateur detective, figure it out? This is where I was finally watching the actual movie that is Last Night in Soho. And that movie is about... So the other thing about Ellie that we haven't talked about yet is that even before she starts dreaming about Sandy, she is obsessed with the 1960s. She drags her grand's entire record collection to college. She knows exactly what era she'd live in if she could choose, and it is not this one. So the fantasy to which Ellie is clinging through her dreams about Sandy is not just one of being gorgeous and fabulous and confident and on her shit in a way she can't quite grasp in real life. It's about living in the era in which she feels like she was meant to be born. And through this lens, it is impeccably clear that Ellie is, first and foremost, a self-insert for Edgar Wright. Normally that's the kind of assertion I'd feel rather uncomfortable making, but I do in fact have the receipts.
There's something, and this speaks to my experience about being obsessed with the 60s as a child, a decade in which I was not born. I was born in 1974. And I was obsessed through my parents' record collection. Now,
before we go too far down this road, I do want to make sure to problematize any one-to-one reading with the simple fact that this screenplay was co-written by Krysty Wilson Cairns. While Wright has the film's sole story credit, having gotten Wilson Cairns on board by pitching her a fully formed outline, her fingerprints are all over several crucial big-picture decisions, like giving a literal voice to Sandy, whose scenes had originally been conceptualized as even more stylized silent sequences, and the addition of the second fantasy dream sequence with the audition scene that is, for my money, pivotal to the story's pacing, as well as a number of details lifted from her personal life. She actually tended bar at the Toucan, and the photo of Ellie's mum and gran outside the Criterion and its accompanying anecdote are pulled directly from Wilson Cairns' family history.
So my grandparents came to London on their honeymoon actually, and there's a picture of them outside the Criterion restaurant, and I remember the first time I'd sort of come to London as an adult being like, oh, I can't wait to go and visit that place that they were at. And I asked my gran about it, and she was like, we didn't eat there. We were too poor. We just took a picture outside and wandered off.
She and Wright also share the experience of having moved from relatively small towns to London for art school. Fine art for Wright and film for Wilson Cairns. So just know that I have taken the appropriate number of grains of salt with my assertion that there is just a certain amount of straight white cis maleness to the conversation Wright is having with his own rose-tinted nostalgia goggles. For my money, liking vintage or vintage-inspired clothes or thinking that music used to be better back in are pretty mainstream things, but everyone around Ellie responds like this is bullyably weird.
There's just something about the 60s that speaks to me.
Ooh. This is rather retro.
I hope you were all listening to that.
Something about the 60s.
You play a lot of that music, don't you?
Is it too loud?
Not at all, but what's that about? It's more my time than yours.
My favorite case in this particular point is when Ellie has been sexiled out into the wild party happening on her dorm floor and a random dude steals her headphones.
You actually listen to this granny shit? How old are you?
This is a reaction that makes just so aggressively much more sense in the context of the moment from Wright's life that inspired it.
This literally happened to me because I was at a house party in 1990, and I was the kind of teen that grew up, not dissimilar to Eloise, listening to a lot of 60s music. It was at the house of a girl that I really fancied, Jo, and at her house party, I put on a tape of 60s music, and Gavin Elwood, my friend from school, heard the song and said loudly, "Who put this old music on? This is awful."
And I I know it's a movie and we sometimes need to play things up for the story's sake, but there is such a massive difference between peacefully minding your own business in a corner with your headphones on and hijacking the aux cord at your friend's house party. It's like the difference between a dare roleplay practicing how to say no to drugs versus actually just saying no thank you to your real life acquaintance who will be thrilled that there's more for them. Nobody cares what you listen to on your headphones. Nobody cares if you think the 60s are cool. Lots of people think the 60s are cool. But sure, Ellie's weird. She's a weirdo. She doesn't fit in. But more important is the core of the movie's thesis on nostalgia. Sandy's story is a conduit not only for Ellie's romantic view of the past, but her eventual disillusionment with its realities. And it is not inconsequential that Wright has chosen a young woman as his stand-in for that lesson. I'm just gonna say it. Every conversation I've ever had about how great it would have been to live in some past time period that didn't have some sort of big shiny caveat about how, of course, it would actually suck, but it's kind of fun to pretend, has been started by a straight, white, cis, non-disabled man. That's not to say I don't know plenty of women, people of color, and queer or disabled folks who are super into the fashion, music, film, art, or culture of whatever era's bygone, but in general, the people who currently have more rights than we used to have are not the ones who need to be reminded that we used to have fewer rights. And even more revealing is what this story uses as the vehicle for that disillusionment. The dark turn of Sandy's story, the part where it ceases to be a fantasy and becomes a nightmare, is forced sex work. Jack, who has claimed to be Sandy's manager, auditions her for a club show that he declines to tell her is a burlesque act, sets her up with professional contacts he claims she must sleep with to work her way up in the industry, and finally, straightforwardly, repeatedly, pimps her out for pure and simple money for sex exchanges. In the framework of this cautionary theme against unqualified nostalgia, the message is that the life of a 60s starlet was not so glamorous as we might think, because she might have been forced to perform sex acts of dubious consent in order to work her way up and or simply keep her head above water.
You told me you were serious about being a performer, so if you want to keep doing it, then these are the kind of men that you need to keep happy, the men you really need to perform for.
No.
Let's unpack that a little. Now, if we are setting up a disillusionment with the rosy-colored vision of the past, that vision is implicitly set against the present. It is hard to tell a story about the past being overrated without at least implying that things are to some extent better now. And the sole vehicle for that comparison in this particular story is sexual exploitation in the entertainment industry. Let me put this in as clear words as I can. This movie heavily implies that the kind of treatment Sandy faces at the hands of the people who are nominally professionally mentoring her is a thing of the past. And while I would certainly never argue that things haven't improved at all since the 1960s...
Everybody knew about Harvey Weinstein. Everybody knew about his behavior, yet nobody did anything.
Comedian Rebecca Corey says she was asked by Louis C.K. if he could pleasure himself in front of her. It happened, Corey says, during the filming of a pilot.
I got a very memorable email from a marketing person at the studio once, where I had sent him this articulate defense of the film, and here's how it should be marketed. And I said, what specifically are you thinking? And he wrote back, Megan Fox hot, 3 words.
For cutting a trailer together?
That
or just
was
for marketing
in terms
in
of
general?
In terms of what is the value of this film.
Michelle Trachtenberg has leveled a new accusation against Buffy the Vampire Slayer creator Joss Whedon, saying he was not allowed to be alone with her on set of the show.
He said that if he was going to introduce me around town to directors and producers, he needed to know if I was any good. He had this sly, sleazy smile on his face. And the fact that he was sitting so close to me on this couch, I started to get a sick feeling in my stomach.
Everybody else is doing it. What makes you so special?
Even the kind of really, really black and white abuse that Sandy suffers, where a person attempts to use claims of connections in the entertainment industry to entrap a bright-eyed newcomer into sex work of, at best, dubious consent, that's happened to someone I know within the past few years. It's not my story to tell, so I won't say any more than that beyond that she's okay, but the idea that situations on the spectrum from blatant objectification to casting couches to more or less sex trafficking were left behind in the 60s is deeply offensive and downright dangerous. Now, to be fair to this movie, I don't think that's a message it thinks it's communicating. Ellie also does deal with sexual harassment in her modern day life, from a cab driver, from classmates, from customers at the pub where she works. Reminders of the existence of sex work are ubiquitous in a way that seems to make her uncomfortable. But this just makes it all the more confusing that she would think there was less of that in the era of Mad Men. It works to the extent that she is a sheltered young woman from the country doing the dance of growing up very quickly in the move to the big city and escaping to the fantasy world of her dreams, but the past isn't a metaphor. It's literally how Ellie and Edgar Wright feel about the actual 1960s.
There's just something about the 60s that speaks to me.
And this speaks to my experience about being obsessed with the 60s as a child.
The two meanings rip into one another. Now, I do want to talk for a moment more broadly about sex work. This is a topic so massive it could be its own series of videos, and it's also something on which my perspective absolutely should not be elevated, because I have no first-hand or even second-hand experience working in the industry. I will link some excellent work from channels that have devoted entire episodes to this topic, including the perspectives of actual sex workers, in the description below. But for our purposes today, what's important is that sex work is a job. Full stop. That doesn't mean that it's not an industry with its own issues of exploitation, both in terms of the exploitation inherent to all labor under capitalism and opportunities and failings unique to the specific line of work. But it does mean that it is a job that real human people do in order to be able to live their lives. And there can be some serious problems with the interaction between the actual existence of that work for the actual humans who do it and the attitudes our society at large holds toward that work, most of which are built on some pretty squidgy and conflicting feelings about acknowledging the existence of sex, especially outside the context of monogamous marriage, at all. Discussions and portrayals of sex work tend to be driven by a pretty paternalistic impulse that, in the most charitable read, is born of subconscious and unquestioned biases, and, as a result, contributes to a stigma that harms the exact people it intends to help. This attitude is as evident in Heart of Gold fiction that portrays sex workers as desirous and in need of rescue from the industry, as it is in actual policy discussions that fold all sex work into human trafficking and talk right past the concerns of the real humans actually affected by the legislation. The idea that sex is a line of work that plenty of folks choose as freely as anyone chooses any job is so uncomfortable in so much public discourse that it often does not even enter the conversation at all. That's not to say that every story about sex work needs to be about or include characters who enthusiastically consent to their jobs, or that stories centering on sex trafficking or otherwise exploitative sex work can never be told. But those stories are still told in the world we live in, and an unexamined portrayal can contribute to the robust stigma that has material consequences for, again, the real humans who do this real work. And unexamined is just about the best word for what we get in this movie. There's a very telling thread in the Blu-ray writer's commentary about both gentrification in Soho and the ubiquity of sex work in the neighborhoods past and present. One moment, Wright will say that he doesn't think of sex work in a moralistic way, and the next that maybe gentrification is sort of okay, actually, if that's the core of the neighborhood.
Little things like that, even like secondhand stories, started to kind of make me think about the kind of like the lineage of people that are in Soho. And in a way, it's not something I think in any kind of I don't think of it in any kind of moralistic way. It's a very strange thing with Soho because it's like, we love it, but you couldn't recommend it unreservedly.
No.
And also, it's that strange thing is it's being massively gentrified, and if there was a point where it came completely Disneyfied and all of the edgy stuff had completely gone, you'd probably be sad, but then you couldn't defend any of the things that are going away unreservedly.
Yes. it would be ruined.
Yes.
But, like, the stuff that had been taken out of it is perhaps not the best stuff that you want to have around.
And I think that attitude is extremely present in the finished product. Sure, some nebulous kind of sex work is fine, we never said that it wasn't, but do we really need to know about it? It's tough to put a finger on any specific moment, any one writing or directorial choice. It's more just the overall vibes. Yes, obviously the worst part of Sandy's situation is that she can't really say no, but isn't it also just kinda ooky in the first place? Aren't these guys gross? They're so eager, and there are so many of them, and they pay her money. Sure, if someone were okay with that, then it could theoretically be fine, but who would be okay with that? Certainly not a nice girl like Sandy. Beyond this being just plain frustrating, it's also so behind the times. It's not just sex work negative, it's sex negative. Its whole position on the horror of what Sandy went through is kind of reliant on the argument that sex is inherently icky. It's not puritanical on its face, it's not hawking any specific rules that women must adhere to in order to be worthy of humanity, and it is pointing the finger at straight male entitlement more than female sluttiness. But it is also kind of taking as gospel the wild misread that sex, for women, is violating by default and must prove itself otherwise. That being said, I have also heard more or less the opposite criticism leveled at this movie, that it is voyeuristic and exploitative to its female characters. And that is one critique I actually strongly disagree with, because it's an area in which I think this movie actually excels. For all my issues with the attitudes towards sex, sex work, and sexual exploitation it espouses, that subject matter is portrayed visually in a way that is so careful to humanize the character being exploited without objectifying her. Some of this is very straightforward, like we never see Sandy's Johns make so much as passing physical contact with her. The act is implied through a careful blend of just enough telling and a lot of very deliberate showing. Sandy in bed, cash on her nightstand, a man buckling his pants. The extent of the exploitation is implied through the repetition of a seemingly innocuous interaction with implications made abundantly clear in context.
What's your name?
Alexandra.
That's a lovely name.
What's your name?
Alexei.
That's a lovely name.
What's your name?
Andy.
It's a lovely name.
And the traumatic fallout is communicated not through the violence of the act itself, but the lingering psychological damage demonstrated visually by the faceless or many-faced ghosts who haunt Ellie from Sandy's memories. What all of this has in common is that it is clearly coming from Sandy's point of view. We are being shown what this feels like for her, not what an outsider might see. This is done with a more subtle mastery in the sequence where Sandy dances at the Rialto. It is a pointedly sexy and objectifying act, and Sandy and the other girls are costumed appropriately for it, but the camera very deliberately does not show us the routine in the way the men in the audience would be watching. It shifts between the perspectives of Sandy, Anya Taylor-Joy giving us the absolute deadest of eyes, and Ellie, who is shocked and uncomfortable with this turn her fantasy has taken. The best example of this, I think, is this very quick shot. It's the only one that really portrays Sandy as a body first, but Ellie is in the shot too, and we see her turn away, and then we cut to shots of the audience. The next time we see any of the girls, they're sitting down in their chairs. It's such a clear little story. We're cut off in the middle of a dance move that is obviously intended to display Sandy's butt as clearly as possible, and Ellie can see where this is going, and in a combination of discomfort and respect, she doesn't want to watch it, so she just kind of looks around around until it's safe-ish to look back. And most importantly, we look around with her. There is one sequence where we do get Anya Taylor-Joy's body on display in lingerie, and I can definitely see how it could read as more objectifying than it needs to be. But for me personally, in the context of the work the rest of the movie puts in, it feels earned to go for it exactly once. We see her cycle through several different negligees, which helps to establish the feeling that this went on for so long. And most importantly to me, the person on the other side of that come hither stare right down the barrel of the camera is Ellie. In the context of this sheltered young woman working through the messaging she's inherited about sex and the threat of sexual violence, this extremely penthouse-style fantasy image feels like it is doing something more than just appealing to an audience who likes looking at Anya Taylor-Joy's body. But you know, this stuff is subjective, so I wouldn't tell anyone that they were wrong for feeling like that was an unnecessary blip in a movie that's otherwise pretty thoughtful. That being said, visual objectification is not the only way for a movie to be exploitative, and on that note, it's time to talk about the ending. As Ellie investigates Sandy's presumed death at the hands of her pimp, she becomes convinced that a regular at the pub where she works, who has a rather knowing and mysterious air and a reputation for being quite handsy, is in fact Jack, Sandy's murderer. She confronts him and tries to get a confession out of him, which he dodges, but before he can reveal more of what he knows, he gets hit by a car and...
Oh, Lindsay, you poor bastard! Call an ambulance, Pet. Now! And tell him he used to be police. That'll make them hurry.
His name's not Jack.
The handsy gentleman is not Sandy's would-be manager, but the cop who interrupted her montage.
What's your real name?
I reckon you're a copper or something.
Realizing that she is completely detached from reality and a danger to herself and others, Ellie calls her gran and tells her she's coming home. John offers her a ride out of the city, and they go back to the apartment so Ellie can pack her things and beg Miss Collins for her deposit back. Over a cup of tea in Miss Collins' office, a few last pieces finally fall into place, and we and Ellie realize Miss Collins is Sandy. She murdered Jack, and a pile of the Johns he sent her way too, and she's just poisoned Ellie. And I'm just gonna be straight with you, I almost walked out of the theater. Now, in a vacuum, this is a perfectly fine twist. If you're watching this movie as a whodunit, the questioning scene plants a lot of very cleverly and deliberately worded red herrings that, along with countless other breadcrumbs from the rest of the story, pay off in a very satisfying way in Miss Collins' confession.
I know where you live, Eloise. And I don't know what you've seen or heard, but I can tell you, Sandy ended up exactly where she wanted to be.
I think you'll find Alex killed Sandy.
The girl did die up there, I suppose. The young me, you could say Sandy, died in that room. She died in that room 100 times.
You think she was an angel, but don't be fooled.
They send me to hell, so I sent them to theirs.
From a pure story perspective, this is good stuff. For me personally, it suffers due to my big problem with the structure of the movie, where it reads as a psychological horror for the first 2 acts and then suddenly hard cuts into girl detective mode without really doing the work to make sure you're on that page. But in a girl detective story, this is a perfectly solid direction to branch off. My issue is with what this twist does to the subject matter. Systemic sexual exploitation and violence is a major issue. It is a real thing in the real world that affects countless real people, and those people watch movies. I would count myself among them. I'm lucky enough not to be a survivor myself, but every experience I've ever had or ever will have, in the entertainment industry particularly, is absolutely shaped by the knowledge that it could happen to me. The fear that I could experience, if not something literally similar to Sandy, at least something violating and traumatic enough to be emotionally resonant with her story, and that I could be denied justice or even basic empathy if I were not seen as the perfect victim, is visceral for me, because it has happened to people I know. Friends, colleagues, loved ones. I have had hairline brushes with it, moments where, in retrospect, if I had made one slightly different choice, a friend's story might have been mine. And this final twist turns on that fear. Lindsay isn't exactly portrayed as a good guy, but he blips in and out of the story so quickly in both time periods that there's not a whole lot of time for nuance, and it's hard not to read the realization that Ellie's accusation was a false one as saying that he's done nothing wrong.
Oh, Lindsay, you poor bastard!
And following this with the revelation that he was, well, right about Sandy is hard not to see as vindication.
You think she was an angel? But don't be fooled.
The man you thought was the villain of this story is in fact a bold, truth-telling hero, and the woman you thought was a tragic hero is a monster. And that's just not a place you can come back from with, oh no, don't worry, we do still like her actually, which is more or less where the movie ends up.
I didn't want any of this.
I know. I saw.
They deserved it.
I know.
Ellie's empathy wins out and she sides with Sandy, even knowing what she did, even with her poison working its way into her bloodstream, even when the ghosts beg her to avenge their deaths. And while she cannot save Miss Collins from choosing to go down with the House of Her Horrors, Ellie survives to debut her first collection with the memory of Sandy still by her side. But the first time I saw this movie, all of that just washed right over me. There's this thing that can happen when you engage with basically any media as a person with literally any marginalized identity. And to be clear, I say this as a cis, white, non-disabled, neurotypical, allosexual, and alloromantic woman who grew up in a rich suburb in the Midwestern United States, lives in Los Angeles, and dates men. Among others, but still. My perspective is, in almost every way, overrepresented in every mass market, but there's still always just this little bit of a time bomb of, is this story going to whack me with the realization that it doesn't quite think I'm a person? And the final 20 minutes of Last Night in Soho were all about seeing that fist curl up and waiting to see if it was going to punch me. The fact that it was ultimately clenched in sympathetic frustration didn't make me any more able to watch and enjoy a fucking horror movie. I wasn't on the edge of my seat, along for the ride and waiting to see what would happen. I was holding my breath, desperately praying that it would take back what it seemed to be saying about me and my friends. And on that note, I'm feeling a little overdressed. I feel like we've been doing a lot of what we talk about when we talk about problematic media conversations lately. I'm pretty here for it, so let's lay some groundwork. First, a couple of things I'm not saying, just because this is the internet and this is how things go. On the farthest extreme, I'm absolutely not saying that Last Night in Soho shouldn't be allowed to exist. I'm not even really sure I'm saying I needed a better content warning. Like, going into this movie with the knowledge of what was portrayed in it would not have stopped me getting pulled out of it by its willingness to play on my attitudes and fears about those subjects. I'm also categorically not saying that anyone who liked Last Night in Soho is a bad person, or a worse feminist than me, or even necessarily possessed of values that are out of line with mine. My opinion of Mikey Newman has not changed one bit since he put this on his top 5 of the year, and if anything, his positive reading very much enriched my more conflicted one. To contextualize the same basic point in a more societal way, I don't think that having an opinion one way or the other about Last Night in Soho is a political stance, and I don't think expressing that opinion is feminist or anti-feminist activism. I'm not even necessarily saying this movie is inherently alienating to all people with real-life experiences and justified real-world fears similar to mine. You know, for a counterexample, a lot of people had similar feelings to what I'm describing with Last Night in Soho about Promising Young Woman, which is a movie I loved and found to be saying some really powerful things. A lot of people felt very differently. I don't think that necessarily means they have had wildly worse experiences or have better values than I do, any more than I think it means I'm smarter than them or more capable of objectivity or something. I think the movie just hit us differently. It happens. So with a few of the most common nots of what I'm doing out of the way, what am I talking about when I talk about problematic or offensive art? For me, what I'm doing is talking about a specific way in which a piece of media is at odds with me that is distinct from something like aesthetic taste. I have a problem with it on the level of at least my values, if not my humanity, and in a way that rises beyond me, the person, to the level of the systems I live in and the cultural conditions in which the art exists. And I think public conversations about how art interacts with those systems and conditions are valuable to have for their own sake. There's a moment in Midsommar, for example, that fucked me up worse than just about any other piece of media ever has. I do not ever want to watch it again, but I don't have anything particularly productive or enlightening to say about why. It was extremely triggering to me personally because of a traumatic life experience that is specific to me, and there was no way for Ari Aster to anticipate the specific traumas of every single person who would one day watch his movie on Canopy in their living room and try to do right by every single one of us. He wasn't making a movie about me. But Edgar Wright kind of was. Last Night in Soho didn't have to be about sexual violence, but it is. Obviously, I'm not saying that movies about sexual violence shouldn't be made or shouldn't ever be controversial or upsetting. Of course not. I already said I liked Promising Young Woman, ending and all. I also wouldn't say that stories about sexual violence against women can't be told, at least in part, by men. The Last Duel stirred up a lot of controversy as well this year for its pretty brutally straightforward portrayal of rape. And while I certainly wouldn't blame anyone for noping out of the movie for that reason, I do think it's very clear how it contributes to the story and the way it is told and to what it is ultimately saying. You can draw your own conclusions about whether the end justifies the means. I'm kinda conflicted about it myself, but it is very clear to what end the means are working. What is Last Night in Soho doing here? What is it trying to achieve by making us question for any period of time whether the woman who survived truckloads of abuse and denied any means of justice or escape made both for herself could actually be the bad guy after all? What is this movie saying about sexual violence? That it's bad? Cool. I titled this video, Last Night in Soho, My Disappointment is Immeasurable and My Day is Ruined. That infamously memed phrase comes from YouTuber The Report of the Week's review of Popeye's Cheddar Biscuit Butterfly Shrimp. Are we doing serious meme analysis? We're doing serious meme analysis, sure. The Report of the Week's whole deal is these totally serious reviews of fast food, but not like quite the level of serious where it's obviously a joke. Review Bra might be a brilliantly crafted character, or just a person who is like that, or somewhere in between. You're never really sure.
Little Caesars, if you remember a few months ago, they released something called the Crazy Calzone, and it was this abomination that people either loved or they hated. Now, the reason why I call it an abomination is because it didn't look like it belonged in this world. It really didn't. It looked like some sort of creature.
But yeah, in this video, he bites into this fucking Popeye's shrimp and is quiet for a little bit, chews, shows the shrimp to the camera, the whole shtick, takes a sip of water, and finally drops,
My disappointment is immeasurable. And my day is ruined.
This is why people watch this channel. But then the rest of the video is, you know, the earnest review of this immeasurably disappointing shrimp, where Review Bra is trying to parse, like, this fast food joint has always had pretty damn good shrimp for a fast food joint.
These butterfly shrimp, from Popeyes were my favorite thing from the menu. I kid you not. I mean, they were so tender, they had a butteriness to them, they just melted in your mouth. Oh, it was so good.
And now all of a sudden their shrimp is just fine. No worse, but no better. And like, I don't know, if it had been Taco Bell's first foray into shrimp tacos, it wouldn't have been a big deal, but there was a bar. And that's what makes it day ruining.
These are chewy. And that's disgraceful. It really is. And it brings it down from something that was excellent to now to below average.
Not that the food is bad, but that it should be good. And this is exactly where I am with Last Night in Soho. My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined. This was my most anticipated movie of 2021, and it wasn't even a little bit close. A little over a year after I started properly getting into horror after a quarter-ish life of being a complete scaredy cat, and there was one of my favorite filmmakers tackling a true, sarcasm-free, red-blooded horror film headed for general release over Halloween weekend. I think the exact moment when I truly emerged from my chrysalis as a beautiful, weird horror chick butterfly was a few weeks ahead of this movie's release when I was talking to a couple of friends. And one of them said they wanted to see it, but they knew they were gonna have to watch Matt Smith murder Anya Taylor-Joy, and they didn't want to see that. And I surprised even myself by just busting out, I want to watch that! I want to watch that very much! I'd like to watch that right now! So on some level, maybe my expectations were just too high not to be dashed. But you know, I think it does go beyond that. It's not just that this movie was like concocted in a lab to hype up me specifically, it's that everything that went wrong about it feels so avoidable. A glittering fantasia about a reluctant girl detective using her supernatural powers to solve a decades-old murder and in the process deconstructing the flaws in her nostalgic view of the past and learning to feel at home in her present is, I mean, that sounds great. It just didn't need to also be about sexual violence. It could have been about literally anything else. A coming-of-age story about a young woman picking apart the deeply fucked messaging she's absorbed about sex in 18 years as a girl through visions where consensual sex and physical violence are one and the same could be entirely unique and truly moving, but would require an astonishing deftness of hand and, dare I say it, a level of personal connection that Edgar Wright probably does not have. A twisty mystery turning around a woman on the run from the legal consequences of her justified vengeance, who is still allowed to fill the shoes of a sympathetic but unapologetic villain, could be dope as shit, but in this specific context, it comes so close to toppling the whole operation that it, like, physically hurts me. Even, you know, little tiny things. Like in the writer's commentary, Wright talks about all of this research they did into the vice cops of 60s London and how corrupt they were. What an interesting angle to deepen this shattering of the illusion of the past. But it ends up as one brief scene that still kind of just paints him as a potential Richard Gere in Pretty Woman. Or I always think it's interesting to watch deleted scenes from the perspective of like, what was this movie almost? And of the scenes included on this Blu-ray release, so many of them hint at Ellie's powers in a more explicit way. Like, not more explicit in quality, but taken together far more in volume than what made it into the movie. I understand from a pacing perspective why each one was cut, but when you take them together, like, half of the proper hints at the supernatural hit the cutting room floor, so of course that aspect wasn't as clear as it could have been. And in the end, that is the worst thing of all. This is a movie that is flawless in its pacing, in its artistry, in the way it buckles you in and whips you along through a wild experience. But it is, ultimately, style over substance. That's a phrase that has been leveled at Edgar Wright plenty of times before, and I think it's one worth unpacking, because while it can be meant as an insult, as style being prioritized at the expense of substance, I would argue that it can also be a neutral statement. There is a greater volume of style than of substance. And in the case of a flashy showman like Wright, that may simply mean that there is a lot of style, to the point where it can actually elevate seemingly mundane substance. There is a version of Last Night in Soho that does this. It's not the one that got made. The one that got made focuses on substance with which the style cannot keep up, no matter how hard it tries.
Hi, thanks so much for watching this video. It's been in the works for a while, I put my whole heart and soul into it, and it's probably gonna get demonetized, and maybe even the dreaded age restriction for saying the word sex one too many times. Cool, very fine and good, yep, love that for me. And this isn't even the spiciest topic on my docket for this year. Spoilers. Trying to make videos with honest, open, adult conversation on a platform where a relatively opaque AI-driven process can just decide your work is too sexy to be seen, much less get paid for, is just so stressful. So you know what makes my life a lot less stressful? This video's sponsor, Nebula. Nebula is an online video platform built and owned by independent creators, including me. Since Nebula creators don't have to rely on advertisers to get paid or on an AI algorithm to get seen, we don't have to worry that we could just lose a month's worth of income out of nowhere for crossing the invisible line of too spicy. Plus that means no ads or sponsor reads on anything ever. Not to mention original series and bonus content that's poorly suited to YouTube for spice level or any number of other reasons. Or, you know, just to say thank you for supporting our work. Nebula is also a killer deal because the good folks at CuriosityStream believe in what we're doing so much that they've worked with us on a bundle. CuriosityStream is the go-to streaming service for documentary and nonfiction content with a library of thousands of titles. If you want some real-life cold case detective work, I'd recommend Who Killed Trudy Adams, which follows investigative reporter Ruby Jones' quest to find out what happened to a young woman who disappeared in 1978 and whose case was never solved. Normally, a whole year of CuriosityStream is just $20, which is already an absolute steal, but when you sign up using my link in the description or by going to curiositystream.com/Laura Crone and using the promo code Laura Crone, you'll get an additional 26% off for a total of $14.79 for an annual subscription. And then you'll get a welcome email inviting you to sign up for Nebula too at no extra cost. And that is a bundle, not just a promotional deal, so you'll keep your Nebula account no extra charge for as long as you stay subscribed. This is the best deal in streaming, and if you haven't done it yet, you should, if you want to. Please. Thank you so much to my patrons, with an extra special thank you to Andreas Evans, Brett C.S., Data Fox, Dylan Larino, Ilona Concetta, Joe Schlesinger, Madeline Capper, Michelle, Patrick Behringer, and Richard Lawson. If you'd like to help support these videos directly and see your name up here with all of these lovely people and check out some exclusive behind-the-scenes and bonus content, you can do that at patreon.com/Laura Crone.